This article is about the lack of enforcement of animal laws in Malta, a small country off the tip of Italy, about half the population of Rhode Island and 1/10 of its size. However, this scenario plays out all over the world. The article was titled, Laws Don't Protect Animals, Enforcement Does. In the wake of last Monday's dog attack, former Member of Parliament Mario Galea argues that Malta already has laws to effectively deal with such cases. What it lacks, however, are the right people with the right tools to actually enforce them. I'll start with the reporter. Throughout your parliamentary career, you have consistently highlighted issues where animal rights somehow converge with human criminality: dogfighting, unregulated zoos, the regulation of dog breeding, etc., etc. And yet, as evidenced last Monday when a self-styled dog breeder was attacked by his own dogs, while facing manslaughter charges over the fatal mauling of his own grandmother in 2020, these issues clearly remain unaddressed. So, first of all, why do you think Maltese governments have always been so reluctant to tackle the purely criminal aspects of animal welfare? Former MP Galea responds, let me put it this way. In Malta, politicians always pay a lot of lip service to animal welfare before every election, only to immediately forget all about it the very next day. And by politicians, I don't just mean labor or nationalist. As I always used to say when I was still involved in politics myself, this has nothing to do with red or blue. Both parties have always been equally guilty. In fact, the only ones who are entirely blameless in all this are the animals themselves. The problem with animals, however, is that they don't have a vote. That's their only fault, as it were, and let's face it, if animals did have a vote, it would be a totally different story. Politicians would be chasing after them every day of the week. But we all know how it is in reality. As far as local politicians are concerned, animals are nothing more than disposable commodities to be exploited for all they're worth before every election, and then discarded the moment they're of no further political use. The real problem, however, is that Maltese politicians don't actually see it that way themselves. If you ask them, as I've done countless times in Parliament, what have you ever done for animal welfare in this country? They will say things like, look at all the legislation we've passed, look at the Animal Welfare Act, etc., etc. And it's true, Malta has, in fact, passed a lot of very good legislation to protect animals over the years. Then again, however, what's the point of even having all these laws if we never get around to actually enforcing any of them? Let's face it, without proper enforcement, laws like the Animal Welfare Act aren't even worth the paper they're printed on. And last Monday's incident was a classic case in point. For example, your newspaper carried a story in which the excuse given by the Animal Welfare Director, Pauline Azzopardi, for not immediately intervening to remove the dogs from the residence was that she was concerned for the safety of her staff, or words to that effect, anyway. The reporter interrupts. Actually, I have a quote right here. Her exact words were, I was not going to put any AWB personnel in danger by just sending them to the house where they would have to face these dangerous dogs. Galea responds, precisely, but that was just an excuse. The real version of events, and I can easily prove this if anyone says otherwise, is that the AWD took so long to actually intervene, well over 24 hours in the end, because they were, quote, waiting for the police to arrive. The reporter, sorry to interrupt, but on what basis can you confirm that exactly? Galea responds, on the basis that I followed this case from the beginning, and when I realized that those dogs had been left unfed all that time, while the authorities were still deciding whether or not to take any action, I took it upon myself, as is my right as an animal-loving citizen of this country, to call the Animal Welfare Director in person and ask for an explanation. And what they told me over the phone was along the lines that they could not take any action legally until the police were physically present on site to authorize it. But not even this answer is true. I know that for a fact. In reality, the AWD does not require any police authorization at law to intervene in such cases. The Animal Welfare Act itself empowers the AWD to take precisely that sort of action on its own initiative. And I know this because I was one of the members of Parliament who passed that particular amendment. So I also remember all the discussions at all the various committee stages when we consulted vets and all sorts of other experts to come up with what was even described as, believe it or not, a breakthrough in animal rights legislation. Because that's how it was presented at the time, as though both sides of the House had just reached an unprecedented agreement that would grant the AWD extraordinary powers, including even kicking down doors, whatever necessary, to be able to rescue animals in distress, and all the rest of it. But, ha! We can all see with our own eyes just how much good that breakthrough legislation actually turned out to be in practice. And this is the point that I've always tried to get across in Parliament, and which I'm still trying to get across today. It's all very well and good to have all the right legislation in place, but laws by themselves make no difference whatsoever in the daily lives of animals that are suffering. It is only through enforcement of those laws that we can ever hope to make a real difference. Everything else is just words on a piece of paper. The reporter says, at the risk of appearing to defend the AWD director, Pauline as a party, also told this newspaper that we are lacking staff and space to keep these dangerous dogs. We would like to collect every single dangerous dog, but we cannot do it without the space to keep them and the staff to do it. Doesn't she have a small point there? Galea responds, yes, she does. In fact, I myself have always argued that for the Animal Welfare Directorate to function properly, it needs to be provided with adequate facilities and adequate personnel. In practice, however, we all know what the real situation is. As far as I know, the AWD only has one animal ambulance currently in service to cover the entire country. But for the argument's sake, because I could be wrong, let's say it has two, one for the north and one for the south. Sorry, but by what stretch of the imagination can just two animal ambulances possibly be considered sufficient to cater for the needs of all Malta's animal emergencies, let alone just one, which is how many there really are? I want to interject here. Malta has 500,000 people. I don't know how many dogs they have, but 500,000 people and one animal control officer, basically? Okay, I'll continue. Galea says, and the same goes for the facilities that house all the rescued animals. I mean, what is even the point of rescuing any dogs at all if all we're going to do in practice is simply throw them all in, together with a bunch of other rescued dogs, into one of Malta's already severely overcrowded animal shelters, just so we can find them dead the following morning? Because the other dogs, through no fault of their own, being territorial in nature, simply tore them to pieces. But anyway, I could go on like this forever, because that's how long it feels like I've been complaining about these issues. But let's stick to the matter at hand. No, the existing facilities are very clearly not sufficient. But then it's not just adequate facilities that are needed, but also adequate people. By which I mean people who have been properly trained and equipped to actually handle real-life animal situations on the ground in exactly the same way as a doctor or nurse would be properly trained to handle real-life medical emergencies. In other words, not the type of people who will have been sent to work in the Animal Welfare Directorate just because they're from the minister's district, or to do them a favor, or for any other reason that has nothing to do with animal welfare at all. Now, just to be clear, I'm not referring to Pauline as a party herself with that remark. I happen to know her personally. She's a nurse by profession, and we were colleagues at Mater Dei Hospital for a while. As such, I can vouch for the fact that Pauline as a party herself is a fully committed animal lover. Of that, there's no doubt whatsoever. But that only brings me to another point. Being an animal lover is obviously going to be an important prerequisite for anyone wanting to work in this particular sector, but it's not the only one. Apart from needing to have the right people, The AWD also needs to provide its staff with all the training and equipment to deal with the sort of situations that might arise. Because let's face it, today's animal welfare sector is not the same as it used to be 10 or 15 years ago. It's no longer just about cats and dogs. Nowadays, the Animal Welfare Directorate might find itself having to cope with an escaped lion or a tiger or a venomous snake or even a bear, because there are bears in Malta now too, and crocodiles and zebras and God knows what else. Reporter, for the record, it was actually in response to one of your own parliamentary questions in 2021 that Parliament released a full list of all exotic animals known to be kept in Malta. Among the 70 species listed were 120 big cats, including lions, tigers, pumas, leopards, jaguars, etc., 3 brown bears, at least 1 zebra, and many, many more. But go on. Galea responds, well, my point is that at any given moment, any of those animals could easily escape from where it is currently being kept and have to be rescued, as in fact has already happened. In 2013, for instance, the AWD was called out to deal with a 5-foot boa constrictor that had escaped from a private residence near the junior college in Msida. These, in a nutshell, are the sort of realities the Animal Welfare Directorate has to actually deal with nowadays. Not to mention the fact that the most dangerous animals involved by far are actually people, like the owner of those dogs which killed him this week, and whose own grandmother was actually killed by other dogs also belonging to the same person just 2 years ago. Now, sorry to keep jumping from one thing to another. That's what usually happens whenever I get started on this subject, but what was the point? Might I ask of Minister Anton Rafalo, even coming out to tell us that, but the dogs which had killed his grandmother in 2020 were not the same ones today. So bloody what if the dogs were different? The problem very clearly is that the owner was the same in both cases. And let's face it, if in the space of 2 years, one and the same person somehow has the effect of turning different dogs into killing machines overnight, doesn't that tell you right there and then that something somewhere is wrong? And that the problem is actually much worse than if the dogs were the same? Because it also means that any dog coming into contact with this particular individual is going to start manifesting uncontrollable aggressive behavior patterns. I mean, it's not exactly rocket science at the end of the day. Reporter, and yes, despite all this, and also the fact that the vets who examined these dogs testified that they exhibited scars consistent with dog fighting, the man was permitted to continue keeping as many as 6 to 8 pit bull terriers in his Msida residence, which brings me back to the question I started with. Do you see a connection between the criminal and delinquent behavior manifested by this individual and the fact that people like him seem to always enjoy immunity in this country? Former MP Galea responds, let me put it this way. I don't have any information myself to the effect that people like that man are being actively protected, so to speak, by the authorities. What I can safely say, however, is that whether it's because they're protected or whether it's because Maltese politicians just don't care, either way, they certainly do seem to enjoy immunity, yes. And bear in mind also that if we even know anything at all about this particular case, it's only because what happened, and we all got to find out. But let's face it, it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. God only knows how many other similar cases will be out there of dogs and other animals that are being kept in the same conditions, that are being exploited for the purpose of dog fighting or other criminal acts, but that we never get to find out about at all. But that brings me back to the point I was making earlier. These are now the realities that the animal welfare authorities have to actually face in their line of duty, and as such, the sort of skills that are required go well beyond merely being animal lovers or simply being good with animals and all that. In today's landscape, there's an entire range of highly specialized skill sets that are needed to deal with the sort of situations that might arise. Simply put, to be effective, and to actually enforce all these wonderful animal welfare laws that we always boast about, the AWD needs to be provided with the right people, the right training, and the right tools. And let's not beat about the bush here. That's not what's happening right now, is it? To be honest, in the USA, a lot of animal control departments are severely understaffed and underfunded, and kennels are full everywhere. Part of that is related to no kill, where they refuse to euthanize anything, and they're always trying to peddle off these dogs somehow that should have been euthanized. We definitely need someone who is as good a public speaker as this former MP from Malta.